All right. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on where you're watching us from, and welcome to Alien Architecture, the season finale of the spring 2021 season of the Trust Your Architect Roundtable Discussion Series at the Cake Contemporary Architecture Center. My name is Dorothy Kiss. I am an architecture student at the University of Toronto and one of the organizers of the Trust Your Architect series at Cake. I will be moderating today's session. Before I introduce our panelists for today, I would like to say a few words about the Trust Your Architect series, which began in 2015 at the Cake Contemporary Architecture Center. Our mission is to organize conversations between professionals as guidance to students about their future career endeavors. Each season, we have a theme to unfold with 4 talks. In pre-pandemic times, we had these conversations in person and in Hungarian. The silver lining of the pandemic being that we have our panelists today from all over the world, which is very exciting for us all. Alien Architecture is the finale for this spring season, where we have been investigating the architect's role in the next 20 years with 3 past events: Pop and Architect, Data and Architects, and Societal Dystopia and Architects. And now let me introduce our panelists today, and thank you very much for being here with us today. First, I would like to introduce Hans Eblings, who is an architectural historian and critique. He teaches at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design of the University of Toronto and is the editor and publisher of the Architecture Observer in Montreal and Amsterdam. Prior to moving to Canada in 2012, Eblings was the editor and publisher of A10, New European Architecture, a magazine he founded in 2004 together with graphic designer Arjen Groot. He is the author of a number of books, including Supermodernism, Architecture in the Age of Globalization, and European Architecture since 1890. He is currently working on the next book called Modern Architecture, A Planetary Warming History. Thank you very much for being here with us, Hans, and welcome. The next person I will introduce is Melody Aschar, who is a design architect, technologist, and researcher. She is the head of architecture and building performance at Icon, a startup pioneering the future of 3D printed housing for Earth and space. Melody is a professor at Art Center College of Design, where she teaches life on the moon. Her background is in industrial design, architecture, and human-computer interaction with an emphasis in robotics. Melody has been a senior researcher in human factors at NASA Ames via San Jose State University Research Foundation, and a co-founder of Space Exploration Architecture, a group developing human-supporting concepts for space exploration. Melody was a leader and member in teams that won first prize in both of NASA's design solicitations for 3D printed habitats, in phase 1 for Mars Ice House and in phase 3 for Mars Ice House. So thank you very much for being here with us and welcome. And finally, I would like to introduce Paul Moiser, who is the author of The Architectural Guide to the Moon and a current Master of Architecture student at the Yale School of Architecture. His research focuses on the intersection of robotics, art, and design. Under the umbrella of architecture, his research looks at robotics and space travel, not just from an engineering perspective. The research aims to demystify and democratize the technology and infrastructure being formed in the Earth's orbit to reuse its progress back on our home planet. Thank you for being here, Paul, and welcome.
Thank you.
So I would also like to welcome all of our viewers and invite you to write any questions that you might have in the chat, and I will do my best to ask our panelists throughout the event. Without further ado, let's get into the questions. We are talking about the future of architecture and space research, but to understand what is going to happen, we must understand what has happened and led us to the present day. So my first question relates to the 60s and 70s when space travel began. And the question is, what was happening on Earth at the time? What kind of impact did space travel have on the architecture of Earth and vice versa? As the architectural historian of our panel today, I would like to first give this question to Hans.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me in this panel. And I think that there's a striking parallel between what's happening today and the current interest in outer space habitats, traveling to planets, and what happened in the 1960s in particular, when it was this first moment, this race to the moon. And I think there's a very interesting parallel between the two periods, also because there was around that time a growing awareness on Earth about the environmental predicament. And we see a similar situation now with this whole awareness of global warming. And I think this parallel is fascinating, and it leads to kind of, just as the two periods mirror each other, I think there's also kind of parallel or similarity in how thinking about outer space reflected back on Earth and the other way around. And I think it's, for instance, very striking that in 1964 at the World's Fair, there was this General Motors Futurama pavilion where they were showing a kind of the prospect of other forms of habitation. And they were showing the desert, the Antarctic, underwater, and space as four categories of extreme environments where there was this evident parallel, even in the kind of the imagery was almost the same. It was, you really have to look carefully to see the difference between what's underwater and what's in outer space. And it reminds me also of those analog missions of NASA where they are going underwater. So there's this kind of, and even if you look at the old outfit of divers and the outfits of the first astronauts, that's almost like the same. So there's the kind of this parallel thinking for outer space and on Earth, and this parallel between the 60s and now, I think is just a kind of fascinating topic. And I'm looking at this from this perspective of an historian, but I think what's great about this panel is that we have two designers on board as well, so we can see it from a totally different perspective as well.
I can jump in there. Well, first off, thank you for the wonderful introduction. It's great to be speaking with you, with everyone here. I think that in my mind, the biggest difference from the Cold War era until now is that back then there was really this concern of national security, at least from the United States perspective, and space exploration and settling on the moon and launching these robotic probes and satellites and whatnot was really fueled by the Cold War itself and the kind of militaristic and national security concerns of the time, which tainted the idea of space exploration for many and technology development for space exploration for many. But today, I think that there's a distinct shift in the emphasis, and that space exploration is now being thought of as a way to make humanity interplanetary for the sake of simply colonizing and pioneering into these new uncharted territories. I think that there's an interest and there's a new belief that space tourism and that these ideas of actually creating moon bases and Martian colonies is becoming a reality and something that we can actually see happening within our lifetime. And it's not so much that I think I think that there's a kind of realism in the commercial development world that has never been around before. People are very excited about space. People are very excited about the reality of actually living on the moon and living on Mars. And it's something that in popular culture and within NASA alike, it feels very real. I think we're on the cusp of a shift in the way that we're going to be thinking about outer space settling and exploration.
I must say though, like I agree with all of that. I especially agree with the repetition of history though, because I mean, the history of space is so tightly knit with like arms race and nuclear war and development of rockets, right? Like it wasn't just about flying to the moon, it's about building the biggest rocket, right? To shoot across the world. And I feel like space travel has remained such a like nationalistic issue. Like even the privatization, it's distinctly American. It's like Jeff Bezos and SpaceX, right? Like all these things, like they are funded, they are supported by Americans. And so I think space like remains very exclusionary almost, and also still this like battleground between countries with now China joining in, right? building their, like just the other week, expanding their space station. Yeah, so I still think a lot of people are left out of it, and it's, I think one moment that really like shifted my way of thought, like I read this thing about the Apollo astronauts, and they were flying to the moon, and there's this image, the first Earthrise over the moon from Apollo 8, and it was the astronauts or the mission coordinator talking, and they said, like, we were so focused on going to the moon that like no one took the moment to take a photo of the Earth. Like, it was almost an accident that they took the photo of the Earth. And I think this kind of mentality repeats itself now. We're so focused on the privatization and helping companies and other people fly to space, and it's all outwards, outwards, outwards. And we're starting to forget again to look back to Earth.
Yeah, I think that geopolitics and frankly, international politics are always going to be of concern when it comes to space travel and space technology development. And it's true that some collaborate more and better with others, but I mean, we only have to look to the International Space Station and what a testament that is to international collaboration for that to actually have come about and for it to be still like an active program, at least for now. I think that we always have to go into space exploration with the best intentions to believe that we can create something better. I mean, for lack of a better word, better and more idealistic than the way that things, and I guess you could say general kind of infrastructural development has happened on Earth. But you're absolutely right. It is in every sense like a geopolitical issue as well.
And I think that's unavoidable, and it's less overt maybe now than it was during the Cold War, when it was really like an equivalent of an arms race. But I think right now with this, the arrival of private companies, it's also more evident that there's an economic aspect to it, not so much tourism, which I think will always be for the coming decades a kind of small set of people. I don't know how you should call it. It's kind of the new version of the jet set who can do this. But I think the real exploration and the extraction of all kinds of materials. Melody, I don't want to nag you with this, but you mentioned colonization. And there's, of course, this kind of the thinking behind it. It's like this process of appropriation, which had happened on Earth when Europeans started to discover the world, is replicating itself, I think. And there's, I think, also again the similarity, because I want to see all those analogies with the kind of the tension about the exploration of the seabed and just the north, where you can see similar tensions, and again similar strategies which are applied on Earth are applied in outer space as well.
I think that's absolutely right. There is a kind of it is a tension. It's a healthy tension in that people are interested in resource extraction on the moon, on asteroids, for example, and there's a huge economic incentive to go about it that way, and that really propels industry, propels privatization to move forward and faster. But it also, on the other hand, enables science and research and general kind of fundamental physics to hop on those rides, you know, and enables those payloads to go to the moon, to go to asteroids in the near future, and do that very basic science and exploration research, which otherwise wouldn't be happening. So it's kind of like you're right. There's a bit of hypocrisy there, but at the same time, I think it's a healthy tension.
Yeah, but I think you can also make a counter argument that says that we haven't been doing so well on Earth. So why would we think we would be better this time when we are going to colonize Mars? I think there's a very problematic anthropocentric attitude that's at the foundation of this thinking about space exploration.
I would agree with that. Like, I am a big space enthusiast. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here. But recently, I've also become very pessimistic, or like I've been trying to find a solution to my own questions, because I agree that it's helpful. We're making all these scientific breakthroughs. I was just talking to my best friend who's like a physicist, and he was talking about that everything in physics has almost been discovered, or like at least all the big parts, and we couldn't make these big breakthroughs without all the support, with all the infrastructure, like going into space. Like, I wouldn't want to hinder someone from making some big breakthrough by going into space. But at the same time, it's almost like the act of going to space. It's like driving to a campsite with like a brand new tent you just bought in an SUV, and then you're calling it like sustainable holiday. Just this juxtaposition of these two facts, that you're like creating good for mankind, but it's so resource intensive. And earlier you had an image up, I mean, before everything started, of all this space junk, right?
I can show it if you want.
If you want to throw it up for some visuals. But when spaceflight started, like, we had this huge post-war industrialization with like plastics being produced and like all these new materials also from space, right? And that's everything that floats in the ocean right now. I didn't even see the second image, but you made the same comparison, right? And I think, like, by looking past, I think that's what's new. The new thing is that we've seen this plastic junk, and we might start thinking about space in the same way. But I fear that a lot of people forget the image on the right when they look at the image on the left.
Yeah, I think there's no question, at least for me, that the semantics of colonization are very problematic. So it not only for the colonialist implications of that, but also because it's very difficult to manage planetary protection and these general interests in sort of preserving the planet as they are, with these interests in settling and sort of maintaining a permanent human presence, which is what the Artemis program that NASA is really pushing is all about, is maintaining a permanent human presence. So thinking about how to do that sustainably and responsibly is a big concern. But I do see it as a great case study, right? To introduce sustainable strategies, to introduce even like regulatory measures for what is an appropriate amount of space debris that we can allow. And then compliance is a different issue, but it is a good opportunity to be thinking very actively about these questions.
No, and I think there's also another reason why it's so important, is because if you see this process of planetary warming on Earth, then finding a better understanding of how you can survive in hostile environments like Mars is unfortunately a necessity, I think, for the near future, to think about how we deal with life on Earth. So again, this is another parallel, and a kind of unsolicited parallel almost, which is extremely important, I feel.
I'm going to jump in here with a question, if you don't mind, which is, so I'm really happy that you are talking about before constructing something, this environment that we create, how will it be, how can it be created? So my question would be related to, for example, that there have been examples of domes and artificial bubbles demonstrating such an environment on Earth. And what are the expectations for building them in outer space, for instance, on Mars? Will they solve our problems or breed new ones? And of course, what about the environmental impact?
In the other day, I don't have images, but I'm just gonna put them in your minds, right? But I saw this one image. It was of a video game city of glass skyscrapers, as we also know them right now, on a different planet. The one in the middle was the bubble architecture. I think we just spoke about it, right? And then the third was this indigenous architecture in North America, where locals had built their houses into the rock, right? And the question was like, which is the more appropriate, or what is the same question that you're raising, right? But with these extra examples, I call them. But Hans was talking about extreme environments, right? And we're thinking of NASA and colonizing, or not just NASA, but like colonizing these other planets and what it could look like. And then how we can learn from that on our own planet. And then opposed to that, I would say, is this new proposal in, I think it's Saudi Arabia, it's called The Line, of then just brute forcing a lion city through the desert, right? With like no respect for anything. And have we really learned anything from, you know, colonizing the extreme environments, also like North and South Pole?
In my mind, there's really two ways of introducing enclosed environments in space, whether it be in an orbital environment or on a surface planetary environment. You basically are either launching materials from Earth, or you're using local and indigenous materials and features of the landscape and the topography to create some kind of shelter from radiation, micrometeorites, etc. Brent Sherwood and Scott Howe came up with a very prolific framework of 3 classes of space architecture. The first, class 1, is pre-integrated and launched from Earth. Basically, you can imagine the lunar module that landed on the surface of the moon is basically a class 1 pre-integrated thing launched from Earth. Class 2 are deployable structures like inflatables and other kind of flat-packed and pre-packaged components that are then deployed in orbit or on the surface of a planet. And then class 3 would be anything that uses the materials, anything that uses in situ materials to create a different type of architecture locally, using, I guess you could say, the intrinsic features of the landscape and whatnot. I've always kind of referred to this 3-class framework when discussing types of space architecture and the options available. It could very well be that we employ and deploy various types of class 1 and class 2 together, in addition to class 3 later down the road, because it is a far greater challenge to be thinking about how to construct with in situ materials in a way that's safe and also that is sustainable, as we've been saying earlier. But yeah, that's typically how I tend to think of it.
And how do you think then of the transportation of material to other planets? Do you see that as a kind of viable solution? Because it seems to me, I'm just the historian, but it seems to me that the approach of using local in situ material is the only viable option, because the transportation over these enormous distances is like virtually impossible, it seems.
Yeah, I think that launching materials and systems, habitat systems, using our current chemical rocket propulsion technology is just prohibitively expensive. It's not going to get us to these beautiful kind of visions of a Mars colony or a lunar colony as quickly as we think. So in my opinion, the most expedient way to get to those larger scale developments where we actually can think about I guess you could say a habitat for more than a crew of 4 on Mars or the moon will be to use in situ materials, yes.
And how did you do that with your competition winning designs for building on Mars? Can you tell a bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. I took part in NASA's 3D printed habitat competition in multiple phases. The first phase was exclusively a design challenge, and this was in 2015. At the time, we came up with a proposal to build a Martian habitat out of ice. It was called Mars Ice House. And that won first prize. I'm just going to pull up the image here. That won first prize in the phase 1 3D printed habitat challenge. So you'll see here that we basically introduced frankly, components of a class 2 and class 3 space architecture. We introduced an inflatable membrane that was deployed on the surface of Mars. We 3D printed a foundation using the local regolith, and then we introduced a number of speculative robotic elements to 3D print water ice shell, a double water ice shell on the interior of the habitat. And we kept it enclosed so that the ice would not sublimate on the surface of Mars. And we also introduced components of a reusable, not a reusable, but a vertically oriented lander to house the mechanical and life support systems of the habitat. In later phases, we introduced a regolith constructed habitat as opposed to an ice habitat. Frankly, the competition organizers were looking, despite the fact that they said that any material was kind of available and open to us to use as a construction material for the proposal, they ultimately were looking for regolith-based proposals. So in phase 3 of this same challenge, I'm switching slides. This was our proposal for a regolith, sulfur-based regolith material that would be 3D printed on the surface of Mars. And on the interior, we introduced a high-density polyethylene inner layer. So both of these proposals are showing how we can use local and indigenous materials that are sourced on Mars to construct a habitat for a crew of 4. And that's my short story of the 3D printed habitat challenge.
Successful story.
Very fortuitous, yes.
Thank you for showing us the visuals. They're mesmerizing to look at and even imagine them one day being built on Mars. It's very interesting what all of you are talking about, the mirror between the architecture on Earth and in outer space and their correlation. Even if we think about in the 60s and 70s with the Archigram's living pod capsules, and today with the energy efficient design and construction that has to be dealt with in outer space, hopefully that will be reflected back to Earth, and for the architecture here, being more conscious in terms of sustainability, environmental waste, and of course the list goes on. So my question now would go towards, of course, designing and the question of what are essential technological developments expected to happen in outer space research in the next, say, 20 to 40 years, but take the years as you'd like. What are you predicting that will happen?
I mean, I think
of course.
To just go 1 step back and 2 steps forward. Like, I think there's like a ideological difference between having to plan in space and having to plan on Earth, right? Because in space, you're always working against the environment, right? Everything's trying to kill you. Nothing, like everything you need to live with, you have to bring, even if it's in a small capsule you build around, right? While on Earth, I think like we should live more together with the environment, together with nature, right? So when we look at these constructions and we think back on how we use them on Earth, I don't think they can be transferred one-to-one. And more maybe industrial change or business change will be this big tourism in orbit we spoke about earlier for a very short time. I think this will change our perception a lot. I think that moves away from architecture maybe and more societal issues, but like a lot of space tourism where I think it would be colonization of Moon or Mars and then space tourism in orbit. I think those will be the 2 key players in the next 20, 40 years.
I can jump in. I think in the next 20 to 40 years, we're going to be looking at a settlement on the moon that is international in scope, for sure. We're going to be looking at how to produce rocket propellant on the moon that will enable the moon to function as a platform and a stepping stone to Mars. Even though I'm so thrilled about the idea of a Mars colony, there's just so much that we don't know in terms of research, in terms of human health, in terms of consumables that will be required for the journey to Mars. And it's going to be a very, very challenging task. So for the time being, my focus, and frankly, I think the focus of many others, has been how can we use the moon as a stepping stone to Mars, and essentially test and prototype that all of our systems that are going to be keeping people alive, that are going to be introducing sustainable resources for oxygen, water, and eventually for propellant production, how can they function with very little risk, and how can we be sure that they're going to stay working for decades into the future?
So you mentioned human health. Is the low gravity? Because I'm really concerned about if you go to Mars and you're exposed to low gravity for a longer period of time, that will have so much effect on even on the cellular level of your body and how everything functions. So that's maybe for me even harder to imagine what life on Mars could be than the technology to build a bubble in which you can exist.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the low gravity environment is going to be it leads to muscular atrophy, right? But for me, the main concern is that on a 6 to 8 month journey to Mars, you're going to be traveling through deep space, and the solar particle events and galactic cosmic rays are going to be an extraordinary amount of space radiation. And we just don't know what the effects of that are going to be on the human body. It's extremely risky. There isn't enough evidence to demonstrate that that we know what allowable radiation standards should be to protect and mitigate against those risks. There was even a study that came out some time ago that said that a one-way trip to Mars would be enough to cause an astronaut dementia. I mean, that's just unacceptable, right? Like, that's not something that we can allow people to do without the appropriate, again, risk mitigation strategies. So the risks to human health are tremendous, and there's just so much that we don't know before we can say that we'll do this confidently.
I think another interesting thing is once you arrive alive, you'll be some sort of a superhuman once you're on Mars, since the gravity is around like a third of what we have here on Earth. I think people will be, I mean, maybe going back to architecture since we're talking about it, but the architecture I see a lot is very earthly, right? But if people are lifting 3 times the amount, they're like opening the doors and closing and moving around the habitat in a totally different way. I think this will also psychologically affect the inhabitants, right? Because while you're already in this mystic wonderland, right, you're physically changing. I think it's very bizarre to be able to behave in such a I think that's the whole thing. It's so close to Earth, you forget you're somewhere else probably, but then at the same time, like you're in a totally different environment that also changed you as a person, physically, like mentally, of course. And you'll be walking about there, and then you come back and you're almost grounded back on Earth. Like, I mean, you see all the it's different from coming from the ISS probably than coming from Mars. I mean, besides the long travel, I guess. But you're going through all these physical changes in the form of gravity and inhabitation. I think that's a big aspect as well, or like a bigger aspect than we probably think it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you watch these videos of the astronauts arriving back, and all of their medical correspondents rushing to come and grab them and put them out onto a stretcher. It's like, and that was only a trip to ISS. I can't imagine what it would be for a longer journey.
It was, I had the opportunity to go on a 0G flight a few months ago. And I think that changed my perception a lot, because I think even more disorienting than that 0G experience was the experience of Moon and Mars gravity, which they can also simulate in the airplane. And just being able, I think it was so much more bizarre because it was so similar, but also not so similar. There was like this uncanny valley of gravity.
And how much time did you spend in this zero gravity?
So they do sets of 20 seconds,
yeah,
and then 5 sets of 20 seconds for like every time they fly the parabola. And I think it was around 20 total. Most of them, or like all of them, were 0G, except the first few where they kind of get you used to it. But I must say it was less getting used to the 0G. It wasn't getting you used to the 0G because it was so bizarre being in these like low gravity situations, and you jump and you hit your head on the ceiling. And I think it's just such a different dimension that I underestimated. You know, I see these videos from the moon of them jumping around 20 centimeters high and coming back down. But I think then being in like a normal flight suit, not a spacesuit, and being able to jump to the ceiling and back, and thinking about how that would be in a permanent living situation, like it really changed how I saw that space. And I think 0G especially is, or like not especially, but separate from that, is so different. I think that's its all own animal, right, to deal with.
That's so cool. That sounds really exciting.
So plan high ceilings in your next.
No, that's absolutely right. We have to think about the changes this is going to make to human ergonomics and the way that we work and we live within these spaces. Even like there isn't a standard tread size for stairs or for ladders for Mars or for moon design when it comes to ergonomic standards and human system standards. So all of this is still being worked out.
And I mean, this makes me so excited, you know, like that's when I get like really excited for space, and I'm so deep into it. And you're mentioning these ergonomic standards, right? And then in a calm moment, I take the step back though, and I think like, okay, like what does space ergonomics provide us back on Earth, right? I mean, a lot of discussion is about exposure of issues and like raising awareness of them, but how can this go over raising awareness? How can we bring more than that back to Earth?
And do you have an idea what we can bring back then?
Well, I think in the beginning I said that's the one where I struggle with my own questions right now, where I look at the pile of plastic and I'm like, this is all the results of the 60s and 70s, right? Which is also the time of this revitalization of like environmental caution.
Yeah.
And you mentioned I think it was also pre-discussion, right? The rediscovery of global warming, right? And how people were burned at the stake again, just like in the Middle Ages. And I just saw these images from this artist and doctor, he's called Fritz Kahn. And he was drawing these humans as machines. And that was as back as like the early 1900s.
I love Fritz Kahn.
Yeah, and like this, like the human in the nature and the CO2 repercussions of all the actions. And this, I think it was just so fitting to this like space analogy, right? Like you're like this human producing carbon in this machine producing carbon in this environment, right? And not sure yet, but as you mentioned, Moon versus Mars, you know, on Moon, you have this situation where it's even less gravity and you don't have an atmosphere. And then you go to Mars, which also doesn't have an atmosphere to sustain humans, but it's more like our own planet. And I mean, what's better, being close to home on a planet that's even more hostile, or far from home that's maybe more grounded in something we've seen before, like a desert or something?
Mm-hmm.
So I think, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
No, I think we all accept that the moon is a completely different environment and only sustainable for a human presence if everything is working perfectly well. But I think that the biggest danger of Mars is that there is this lure, this attraction, that it might be possible to tweak it and to start tweaking it in such a way that you create this terraforming process and that it will become Earth-like. And I'm completely baffled by all those documentaries claiming that with a little bit of triggering something, you will create an atmosphere, and then you can seed, plant some seeds, and then you will get an ecosystem. I think it's just incredible, this way of thinking that you can completely tweak the environment. In that respect, this whole eco-modernist idea that we can work our way out of our current problems by using more technology, the same technology that brought us here, is, let's say, a mild version of this pipe dream of creating a human, an Earth-like environment acceptable for human life on Mars. So in that sense, I think also your work, Melody, I love it.
He froze for me.
I think it's fascinating, undercurrent of belief that at one point Mars will be covered in a nice atmosphere and is okay.
Could you repeat that question one more time?
No. So I think, are those beautiful projects you're making for Mars, aren't they the first steps of making the minds ready for this process of terraforming? And with all the let's say, ethical and philosophical and scientific problems related to that?
I thought you were speaking about terraforming. I'm a little bit skeptical when we veer into the kind of science fiction realm of terraforming an entire planet, because we just don't have demonstrable evidence that we can do this for a contained system, let alone for an entire planetary surface. So I'm openly skeptical about those types of proposals or those types of concepts. But what it does get at, and I think you said this very beautifully earlier, Hans, is that we are trying to think more in terms of how to preserve an ecology, for lack of a better word, between the systems that we're bringing to the planet, the environmental and life support systems, as well as the humans and possibly animals and others that will be kind of living within this enclosed, hopefully closed loop environment. And there's just so many ways of thinking about how that can happen, ranging from even the spacesuit itself, which has its own backpack, like a small environmental life support system that monitors air, temperature, pressure, humidity, etc. And then thinking larger for like a habitat for a crew of 4. What are we introducing for water waste remediation? Aboard the ISS, the astronauts drink their own pee, but are we going to be doing the same for waste removal? Are we going to be thinking differently about like sweat and the human body? There's all kinds of ideas that can really shift the way that we think about introducing sustainable measures for life support. So I'm excited, and I hope that we're not just pushing more technology and more hardware, and we're actually rethinking different ways of introducing sustainable solutions for this as a problem.
And I think to go back to earlier, but like, I really appreciate that aspect of it all, right? That's this environmental living, this ecosystem living. I mean, maybe not for the short-term missions, but for the long-term missions, right? You need a whole working ecosystem that is sustainable and you can live with for a long period, and balanced especially, right? And that's what we should have on Earth. So the idea is, okay, if we can do it there, we can do it back on Earth. But at the same time, again, it's an inward perspective. It's into the capsule that sustains the life versus back on Earth, where it goes beyond the walls, right? Your ecosystem cannot be like, if you would raise the same amount, or like if you would need the same amount of technology and support as the station would need on Earth, people would say you're crazy, right? Just to have a sustainable farm every day, a truck will arrive with gasoline. So yeah, I think it's very honorable. Like, I really appreciate it, but I think for then the people back on Earth, they do have to take that with a grain of salt and switch their mentality back.
Yeah, but in a way, it allows for a kind of new appreciation of this image of Buckminster Fuller, of this idea of a spaceship Earth, and this idea that we are steering it in a certain direction. And I think in that sense, even though I believe that many of the ideas about Mars in particular are really far-fetched, at the same time, they help to enhance an awareness of what we're doing on Earth. And that's, I think, really meaningful. And in that sense, this idea of the mirroring effect is of great value, for me at least.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the human analogs that you mentioned earlier that we have here on Earth, whether they be underwater for Nemo or high seas in Hawaii, or even some of the Antarctic exploration missions that are happening today, they teach us so much about what it means to live in these extreme and hostile environments and isolated environments as well. Sometimes, and I'm not such a fan of this narrative, but sometimes there is this kind of argument made for space exploration, which is that we need to become interplanetary to avoid this kind of apocalyptic vision of Earth kind of going astray, and we need to enable a kind of backup plan for humankind by colonizing into space. And I really resist that argument, and I really resist that way of thinking, because the analogs themselves terrestrially can teach us so much more about what it means to live efficiently, sustainably, and living in a hostile environment itself. Not to say that I think all of Earth will become as hostile as Antarctica, but there is a lot for us to learn, even in living in big cities or small suburbs.
I must say though, like coming back to the Buckminster Fuller, right, us working on the spaceship Earth together, right, it is such a bummer that things are created now like the Space Force, right, and slowly we're falling back into old habits, like where we've lived so peaceful in space for as far as we know, right? But now, like through I don't think like the political issues can be avoided, right? Why does China need its own space station? Why can't they build it together with? I mean, they are present on the ISS, right? But why can't they just continue that joint project? Why does it have to be separate? Maybe we can't figure everything out that way, but we should definitely avoid things like Space Force and starting to think I just before this I reread the mission statement. It was like to protect assets and interests in space, right? It's just the same thing repeating itself.
Absolutely, yeah.
We have a comment from one of our viewers, Peter, which goes, as the current subject has a time frame of 20 to 40 years, do you believe in the coming decades, humanity will attempt to discover Proxima Centauri and attempt to colonize it besides the moon and Mars?
Well, I think we talked about space travel, right? I think the problem right now is reaching, like how far is our reach? I mean, we have the Voyager missions, right? The things that are the furthest object from Earth, and they've been flying for decades now to reach the edge of our solar system. So I think colonizing moons and planets besides Earth or Mars in the next 10 years at least is a little ambitious.
Yeah, I think we have to stick within our solar system for one, and then I really do think that the moon is an extremely viable prospect for infrastructure development, for a permanent presence in the next few decades. It is only a few days away, right? So if something goes horribly wrong, an evacuation mission would not be out of the question. And I do think that there will be international countries rallying together to make this a reality.
There's a conversation beginning between viewers which began with someone, Sophia, relating to something that Paul said a few minutes ago. She says that this makes me think of that short story by Ray Bradbury, Dark They Were and Golden Eyed. And another one of our viewers, Chaba, said that he definitely had a vision of deep interaction of humans and Mars. I was just wondering if you could link to these thoughts.
Well, I have to look at Golden Eye.
I can say something about this human interaction, because one thing is also fascinating is that there is, let's say, concern about the hardware of how to put something on the moon or another planet. There's a concern about how to make human bodies survive. But for me, the biggest nightmare would probably be to be stuck with 3 other people in this little bubble for I don't know how long, and what kind of mental effect it would have to be confined and to be. And I think many of those analog experiments on Earth were at least partly disastrous because of human interaction and how people were driving each other completely mad about the smallest things. So, and I think if you look at much of the Western world, where divorce rates are of couples are in the 40 or 50% nowadays, then you can imagine if you're forced to be with 3 of your colleagues on another planet, what kind of issues you will get then. So
yeah, we did hear the divorce rate went up during quarantine.
Yeah, COVID. Exactly.
It's a difficult thing. Crew composition and psychology and crew dynamics can be absolutely disastrous. I agree.
I think that's also where the architecture might come back in, because I think that sterile architecture we've come to know is not sustainable for this kind of life you're describing, right? Mm. And I think a lot of it is, partly it's due because of its function, right? It's very function driven as of now. But I think even if we look into the SpaceX capsules, they've definitely been designed as opposed to the Apollo capsules, for example. But that design is even more sterile than what has come before it. And I think this almost modernist architecture that is going into space, or futurist modernist, I don't think that will be too sustainable for long crew missions. And maybe we go back to something more homey. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon with kind of the trend and the looks of designs right now. But I personally am thinking a lot about how that would look like to have this. You have the bookshelf in the background, that brown bookshelf. And I think that's a view that you wouldn't have if you live on Mars. And I think it's something that people will miss, and that will affect their crew composition and their crew fighting.
And I think related to this, because I believe you can see a role in architecture of bringing people together, not only literally, but also in a kind of metaphorical way. So it leads to the essence of architecture. And at the same time, I think what's fascinating is that everything related to space, travel and colonization of planets so far is either extremely sophisticated or completely rudimentary. So if you look, for instance, at the stuff that Grumman is producing, they are producing just flying containers or vehicles which are nothing but 4 wheels and a frame. And at the same time, there is also this kind of the glamour image. I have an image I want to show you, which is showing this. So where are we? If you can see it already. Here you have 2 products of Grumman on the left, and then an Audi concept car. And the setting of the car is the same as what you see on other planets. But it's, I think, the first time I realized that Grumman, with all those step vans, is also a company that's making super sophisticated stuff for space travel. it really blew my mind. But it's, in essence, it's the same. And I think that's so fascinating. And so the Audi is like a fantasy version of what can happen in space, while the reality is the step plan, or the other version of it.
But I will say, I think what Audi is doing here, that's how orbit will look like, for sure. Like, I think that's not how colonization will look like, but in Earth orbit, through the tourism industry, through everything that is to come, who is flying, right? Like, that's definitely the style and look it's going to look like. Next to all that space trash we showed earlier will be the Audi van.
Oh, and then it goes back to what we've seen in the 1960s with here in the middle, but Françoise Hardy in her fashion outfit, or here with Jane Fonda. It's a kind of the fantasy of what it is.
I think there's always going to be a balance between utility and function, and then what we would maybe call aestheticizing. But even the rover comparison, which I actually really like, that very basic unenclosed rover, is extremely dangerous for use of anything longer than a few hours, I suppose, on the lunar surface or on the Martian surface. If you have some kind of solar flare or solar event, that's going to completely, like, it's going to give everybody acute radiation sickness on the surface of the planet. But a pressurized rover, frankly, some of the concepts that NASA has come up with function like a little habitat that's on wheels. And there's a lot of benefit to be had for a kind of mobile environment that you can use to explore the moon and Mars. I think that that's one of the leading kind of candidates right now in terms of an exploration vehicle is the SEV. It's got a toilet, it's got sleeping areas, and you kind of wonder to yourself, why have an outpost that's kind of stuck in one location when you can actually have a moving or roving architecture that can keep you alive and also ensure that you're doing the kind of planetary exploration that you're actually there to do.
If I may chime in here, I have another image which I really like, is this one, where you can see how little difference there is between the aesthetics from the 60s and of today, which I think is also fascinating. It's basically the same vehicle, which has had a few updates stylistically and nothing else. But this is the kind of object you're talking
exactly.
of. Yeah.
So after the RV industry had the COVID uplift from everyone buying RVs, they will go to space with all their profits.
Yes.
We have another question in the comments, which is, should architecture on arrival resemble structures on Earth for psychological reasons, but shift to better suit life on Mars over time, as future generations on Mars would not have known life on Earth?
I think that's a super interesting question. And it reminds me of the first generation of icons on your smartphone, which were reflecting bookshelves like this and microphones like Frank Sinatra had in the 1940s. So you have to prepare always everyone for the kind of the mental process of getting used to something new. And that's also why I think until very recently, the majority of automobiles were looking like their predecessor with a horse in front of it, because that's what we identify as a car. So I think yes, and so maybe that's an implicit criticism of all those super futuristic looking designs for the moon and for Mars, that they are one step too far, maybe right now. So maybe they should be inflatable Swiss chalets or something like that.
Maybe Melody, you have an idea since you're a interior and exterior designer on Mars already.
Well, I think that there's multiple kind of, I guess you could say, drivers, which is that at least for the commercial space development companies, they're thinking about their future customers. They're thinking about what will the look of a high-tech futuristic space environment be, and is that something that aligns, like we were mentioning earlier, with the mental model that people have of what life in outer space is supposed to be. And that increases confidence and security in having them be a transporter, right, of people to space, of which there are not many. Like, this idea of a civilian astronaut is still a very new one that's exclusive to the rich and brave and courageous. So yeah, how we break away from that, I'm not sure, but it is something for us to notice, and it is something for us to pay attention to. Like, what are the drivers of aesthetics when it comes to space environments? I think mostly in terms of interiors, because exterior is very, very rarely driven by aesthetics, in my opinion, apart from the work that I've been a part of, which is all conceptual and schematic at this stage. But when it comes to space interiors, we have to be thinking about the origins of certain form language. We have to be thinking about the origins of certain decisions and drivers that are being made. Otherwise, you know, there is a way to kind of rationalize inefficiency when it comes to space interiors aesthetics. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's important to have a designer at the table when decisions are being made. So we can be thinking about human factors, introducing a pleasant and operable environment for many types of people, not just for a few types of people, and thinking about what that might look like.
But I guess there's also, in general, our conception of architecture is very much based on our awareness of gravity and how gravity works. That's why we have walls like this and floors like that, because 90 degrees makes sense. And in environments with much lower pressure or no pressure, the bubble is the obvious solution. So finding a way of addressing this sense of homeliness that we know from Earth and creating it in an environment which has no straight walls, basically, is, I think, a paradox. It's or a contradiction. So it has to come from other things than formal elements. So it has to be the atmosphere, basically, to use the appropriate word in this context.
Yeah, I think the structural considerations are always paramount. How do you contain pressure? How do you ensure that you have a breathable environment on the interior? And are you introducing material and structural systems that can actually work in your favor as opposed to against you? Yeah, up until now, we've basically only been working with tin cans. And I'm excited for a future in which we can be rethinking inflatable materials. We can be rethinking local and in situ materials and how they can work in conjunction with other earth-brought materials. And that will really expand our palette for what's possible in terms of extraplanetary living.
I mean, but it will always be restricted, right, by what fits in the rocket. I mean, despite phase 3, when we start building with local materials, but the core will always be the same, at least for the next 40 years. I make the timely prediction.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
There is a connected question, which is, I wonder if it would be possible to create structures that transform in themselves over time from generation to generation to better suit the life on Mars.
I mean, that's where the ecological aspect comes in, because I recently have been thinking a lot about satellites and satellites design from like a robotic perspective, and we make these or like, let me just sort of use the word right, and they do break after being exposed to all this solar radiation, but they don't dissolve, they don't break down, right? So you have these broken time capsules that float in a circle for the next 50,000 years or millions of years. I think someone's talking. It's a little bit loud.
From my end, I will.
But I mean, yeah, you have these capsules that fly around for millions of years and they don't change. There's these old broken boxes. And I think if we fly to Mars, whoever raised the question, right, and we have this architecture, I think we can start thinking about how it will maybe not decompose, since you don't want everything underneath your feet to disappear, but definitely get affected in a positive way over time. But there's no plants, there's no foliage to overgrow your shelter. So I don't know what that could be yet, besides, like, so far it's just a nuisance if you have the environment affect your habitat.
You're muted, Hans.
Transforming structures over time is a kind of a dream on Earth as well. And there are all those attempts to create a kind of flexibility between structure and infill, and or buildings where parts are replaced because they have a shorter life cycle. But it turns out that if you try to plan it, it's always extremely difficult. Whereas in reality, almost everyone has a house where at some point you get a new bathroom or a new kitchen, or you build a sunroom, and there it works. But as soon as you start to plan it and try to make it into a system, it becomes really complicated. And obviously, you cannot have this loose mentality we have on Earth by renovating your own house whenever you deem it fit. If you would be on another planet and there is this scarcity of materials and tools to do so. So I think as an ambition, it's really commendable. But if it can be a reality, I think you're right, Paul, that it will be that there will be different trash heaps on whichever planet or moon humans will set foot.
We're basically thinking about adaptive reuse on a planet we've not even gone yet. So, I mean, I agree, it's maybe a little bit early.
Yeah.
We have another question, which is, I will rephrase it. Is Neri Oxman's architecture here on Earth, can we make it in a space environment? Is that a possibility? Which I guess goes back to our questions about structures on Earth that might be outer space-like, and bringing them to outer space.
I do think that there is a future in which, I mean, I can't speak towards all of her work, but I know most of it. I do think there is a future where we can be thinking about swarm robotics in a way that will introduce new types of architecture, let's say structures, and possibly in the future pressurized habitable environments for people. I do think that there's a way to be thinking about bioregenerative systems in a way that could be appropriate to architecture, like grown systems, grown materials, especially if we're thinking about in situ resources on Mars. But all of that is very, very, very early stage research, none of which has really been developed to the point of actually being let's say an Earth-based construction system that can house even, 2 people over the long term. So I'm excited about the potential of these technologies and these fabrication ideas. And there could be a place for them in the future. It's just a matter of when and how long it would take.
I mean, I feel like Neri Oxman's architecture and arts is almost like a metaphor for the space architecture, since it's like these organic things, these obscure organic things that take so much effort and intricate work to become these organic objects, right? Where organic the word should be used in something that just happens or is existent, right? So again, we have this juxtaposition of like nature and nature-like and what we learn from it. So I really respect her work and what it does, but at the same time, I also again question if it's the right approach. Like the same with environmental architecture here on Earth. I mean, we should be working with nature. It should come so easy if we do it right, rather than forcing it so hard to look right.
Oh, and I think there's another paradox as well, is that one of our obligations on Earth is to use less material and to build less, and to ensure that we will still have sand in the next 10 years, for instance. And the whole thinking about building habitats on the moon or on Mars are still based on this industrial revolution thinking of doing the same kind of urbanization that we've been doing in many parts of the world since the last 250 years, and replicate it and use the same mentality and the same way of thinking about it. So perhaps Mars could also be an invitation to fundamentally rethink what it is to create architecture and to build out of stuff. Given the fact that it will be extremely difficult for any form of life to be sustainable outside our atmosphere, I'm not sure if an organic approach is the most logical one here.
Yeah, it is a really interesting paradox that we're kind of circling around. The one real benefit and the one real opportunity when it comes to thinking about life on other planets that I see here is that it's easier to imagine exponential growth on Mars. It's easier to imagine a system that grows itself or that expands rapidly, exponentially, in a place that is out of reach, that is hostile, and that we're hoping will require as little human intervention as possible. So it does serve as a kind of appropriate context for this work, and how it might be best applied. But again, I see there being so many constraints working against it, not the least of which is the fact that it's very hard to sustain life on other planets. So conceptually, metaphorically, as you said, Paul, I do think it's a very appropriate kind of, there are appropriate parallels, but in actuality, I wonder how implementation would actually happen.
No, but then again, the metaphors are extremely important because they propel our imagination and our thinking. And if there were no people in the 19th century with this kind of imagination about, let's say, the Jules Verne's of the world, if they were not there, we would not have gone to the moon, I think. So it is important that you create this kind of foundation of ideas upon which we can build our concrete proposals for what it can be. So there are these beautiful Chesley Bonestell images from Mars from the 1950s. And they look very much like the desert in Arizona, but it's helpful, again, to get an idea of the direction we can move in. And so in that sense, I strongly believe that aside from all the scientific and technological advancements which are necessary and of course fundamental, there's also the relevance and importance of this kind of literary, imaginary ideas about what it is to live on Mars.
My next question is related to the architect's role, which we have been discussing the whole session so far. But to ask it precisely is, how is architecture in outer space connected to the work of architects in a non-aerospace engineering field? We have been talking about this. And then the question is, how can an architecture student relate to what is happening beyond? What will the architect's role be within all of these developments? So if you could give a kind of a more specific answer to this question.
No, I can say something about it, because what I always think, not being an architect, but being in an architectural school and having followed architectural education for quite a while, I'm always struck by the fact that for a very long time, the majority of designs made, assignments in design in architectural schools are for projects which are basically projects we already have and already know. And so it's a new library, but it's still a conventional library for a neighborhood. It's new housing, but still housing based on the conceptions we have today. And I think one of the fascinating and marvelous aspects of what we're discussing here today is that this is really triggering the imagination to design something which is fundamentally different. And by doing that, you have again this mirror that you realize what all your biases and assumptions are about what good design is. And I think that makes it really fascinating and also extremely relevant and important, even though it's sometimes still dismissed as a kind of freewheeling irrelevancy. But I think it's super important to think beyond tomorrow and as being the next day. This is tomorrow, which is farther out.
I mean, I am currently going through architecture education. I've not had it in undergrad, and I must say, I mean, what drew me to it and what I'm experiencing is this education to be like a Swiss Army knife, doing everything alone. And I think a little bit that's also the problem, like always biting off too much than you can handle. And I think what we can really learn from science, or what drew me into this whole aspect and how I like to work, is really taking this design approach, physically meeting, talking, and working with scientists and bringing it all together. And I think if we start treating like landing your spaceship architecture on Earth the same way we treat working interdisciplinary to live on other planets, I think we can really learn from it. So I guess for me, it's all, maybe metaphorically, like we just said, it's metaphorically thinking you're landing on Mars, but like landing on Earth and really thinking about these ecosystems more, right? There's so many things we don't understand. Like there's so much material that has to be consumed to build what you're imagining. And that's what we learn, but also that's what we don't learn, right? How does all of that fit together? And as you said, I think the space can be, or like all these inspirational images, or Oxford's architecture is like, we can learn so much from it, or be inspired by it, maybe even more than learn from it.
In my experience, the architect is compared to engineers, systems engineers, who are looking more holistically about the problem of living and settling and establishing systems-based solutions on the surface of the Moon and Mars. The thing that makes an architect distinct, and I think this works very well with what you're describing, Paul, is that we're a kind of generalist in that we know a little bit about everything, but are not technically, we don't have the technical expertise to necessarily focus on one element of what it means to design a habitat. And so by knowing a little bit about everything, you're able to sort of have interdisciplinary conversations and synthesize engineering constraints in a way that I don't think other professions and other backgrounds necessarily do. At least that's been my experience. That combined with an emphasis in human factors, an emphasis in designing for people and in the long term, designing for the needs and wants a crew and the dynamics of a crew is something that I don't think is represented very much in aerospace, generally speaking. So there's lots of opportunity for rethinking the way that systems are traditionally designed. And if there's any kind of indicator, well, I think in the last decade, the software industry has been very correct and very, I guess you could say, pointed about the necessity of having designers at the table from the beginning of any kind of engineering, let's say, project or challenge that's brought on, because it can introduce radical efficiencies earlier, as opposed to bringing a designer in later in the process. And it's really looking for that white space, that area of opportunity that only a designer can think outside the box to throw in a cliche, to identify, that is going to radically transform the way that we think about solutions for space. Yeah, that's what I would say.
I see Hans's eyes thinking.
Yeah, no, I'm still thinking. I think you're totally right, Melody, and I think the mentioning software is interesting, because there is a kind of distinction between the kind of architecture which is made to stand out and to attract attention and show a kind of artistic quality, versus the intuitive design that we now all are familiar with everything that's basically digital. And I'm at least old enough to remember that when you would buy a television with a remote control, it took you days to discover why all those buttons were on the remote control. And nowadays, nothing surprises you anymore. You know it right away. There's a kind of this intuition. And I think in many instances, architecture and architectural education is focused on this standing out instead of on the intuition. And particularly thinking about this, the kind of psychological aspect of creating environments for people who are confined to a small space with a group of people who are not necessarily their best friends. This intuitive aspect is perhaps extremely important compared to whatever design you can add to it as a kind of flavor. So it's more like everything should be self-evident. Because you can imagine, if you're on Mars, if nothing is self-evident in your environment, then you shouldn't be burdened by this extra issue and problem of whatever a designer has thought out for you.
As our time is slowly approaching to an end, I would like to ask all of our viewers to send in the last questions that they have. And of course, ask all of you to say a few closing remarks and the best advice you could give to architecture students or young professionals or people who were in architecture and realized that this is not what they want to do. Anything really that you think would be helpful or would have been helpful for you at some point.
People who don't want to do architecture, or people who don't want to do earthly architecture? Well, for me, I think I also was a little bit disappointed at earthly architecture in, I think, the way Hans described the education to be today. But I think this research or the talk we had, like these things that I'm researching in my own time and on the side, right? That's really what keeps me going. And I think that that's what really teaches me again at like, it's almost like my own education. It's like, that's what I take back to the discipline. Working interdisciplinary is definitely something I have done for a while. And I don't like, I see architects work interdisciplinary, but not be interdisciplinary amongst the others. So I think for maybe advice, going out there and meeting people from other disciplines and actually then working with them for real together is what really opens my eyes, at least. I
can say from my end, my space architecture career and the work that I did in this field started with a competition. So it was nights and weekends. We all had day jobs, the team that was submitting. And it really was a passion project, and it sort of spun off into other collaboration opportunities internally at NASA, and then other collaboration opportunities with commercial partners like UTAS and Collins, and it really took a life of its own. But I think the platform of the competition and the fact that we were posting this work online to a community of people that were very excited and very enthusiastic about seeing what it looks like to live on Mars, that was really the key thing that launched us into this space. Man, what a cliche. I really think that there's a lot of value in sharing your work on many digital platforms today and reaching out to the people whose work you admire. And that is really, in my opinion, what establishes the synergies for future work and opportunities to happen. And I see it happen all the time with my students and then with others I've collaborated with over the years. So if it's something that you love and you're passionate about, you have to really just give yourself the time to do it and put it out there into the world and see where that takes you.
Oh, well, I don't have any advice. I'm an historian, so I'm just observing things. But what I think is really great about the discussion we've had today, and also the thinking about architecture for other places than Earth, is that the majority of projects you usually get involved in as an architect are commercially driven, based on real estate values, and making profits. And of course, there's now a commercial dimension to space travel as well. But in essence, we're still in a stage where we have to think about the fundamentals of it. So it's a kind of the essence of creating a habitat, which is a term which was used in circles of architects in the 1950s and early 1960s, but more or less vanished from the vocabulary. And now there is a reason to revisit this whole notion of habitat and to rethink both for other planets and for Earth what it is to offer human beings, but also other animals, a place to live. And so I think in that sense, it's again a kind of indirect effect of what we've been discussing, forces everyone to think about the essence of the profession of architecture.
Thank you very much for the closing remarks. Architecture is such a complex field and so diverse, and collaboration really is what keeps it always evolving, which is why we're very grateful that all of you are connected to architecture, but in different ways. And really, from all of you coming from different parts of the world, I feel like this is the way to have the most global perspective possible, to see all diverse perspectives. So I would like to thank first our viewers for tuning in and asking very interesting questions, and last and certainly not least, our panelists for joining us today. It has been an honor to have all of you here. Alien Architecture was our season finale for the spring 2021 season of the Trust Your Architect Roundtable Discussion Series. We will be back in the fall time, online or in person. That, of course, is a question. Thank you for tuning in, everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the conversation.
Pleasure.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye.